Good evening. I want to thank University of Colorado Boulder students Savannah Mather, Noah Schwartz, and Shelby Arbach, and recent graduate and gainfully employed Ben Roscoe for their encouragement to come address your community. My friends, those here at Boulder's Law School and those in your offices and homes zooming in, welcome to the second of 10 talks on our Road to the White House No Excuses tour. We meet today, September 23, 2021, at an extraordinary moment. I mean by that more than just that Congress is right now considering President Biden's climate package as part of the so-called budget reconciliation bill. That process is important. And some of you here, I know, especially those from Citizens Climate Lobby, are following it closely, even attempting to influence it. So we will take the occasion to return to the budget bill in a little bit. But what I mean primarily, and also, is that we have just learned far more about our immediately past president and how his erratic and juvenile approach to politics presented a signal threat to our nation, not only by his attempted disruption of the peaceful transfer of power here, and thus democracy in America, but also to the prospect of peace, including with China. And so in my view, the question whether or not Army General Milley crossed any formal line of authority is really beside the point. What is clear is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs sought to contain an unstable president and guard against the potential he presented for an entirely unwarranted nuclear conflict. Circling back to the climate crisis then, someone needs to say it, so I will just do it here. The climate crisis is a global problem. It cannot be resolved without the cooperation of the largest present greenhouse gas emitter, China. Nor can it be resolved without the largest historical and cumulative emitter, the United States. And a military conflict between the two simply would eviscerate the potential for such cooperation. At minimum, it should have been unthinkable. That is one reason why it is critical that we henceforth keep Trump and any other person of questionable sanity out of the White House. As for the climate crisis itself, we discussed at our September 14 opening kickoff event for this Road to the White House No Excuses tour about some of the devastating regional implications of our unarrested fossil fuel emissions. After all, few people merely experience global warming on average. I mean, very few people are experiencing merely 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming and no other impacts. On average, you could say the Earth is smooth if you averaged out the mountains and valleys, but that's not how we experience the Earth. The terrible heat waves and fire that has impacted the American West so heavily in recent years, those may ultimately be caused or exacerbated by global warming, but they are proximately caused by its secondary effects. Those almost certainly include more frequent breakdowns of the jet stream, leading to incursions of high pressure systems well to the south of its usual course. This year, those parked over the Pacific Northwest for a considerable period, and there allowed the sun unremittingly to bake the surface beneath. When coupled with the prolonged drought conditions, also a function in part of global warming, there is then little surface moisture to absorb that heat, so that surface temperatures soar and fires explode into conflagrations. last year, something similar occurred in my region, the Pacific Northwest. I live in Eugene, Oregon. And that was also of a piece with the general picture that I am depicting. The unprecedented firestorms up the Mackenzie Valley to the east of my hometown, they were in fact reported on by the media, of course. But no major outlet really explained what happened there with any real degree of precision. So here is my own rendition, based on my piecing it all together, with the help, actually, of the atmospheric scientist Jennifer Francis, who's the deputy director of the Woodwell Climate Research Center. And to assist, I'm going to show some images from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Now, the jet stream is maintained in a loose ring around the Arctic by the temperature differential between the Arctic and the subarctic portion of the Northern Hemisphere. There is some stochasticity in it, some variability, but generally it stays roughly within its place. But because the Arctic is heating up much more rapidly than the other parts of the planet, that differential is losing its grip and the jet stream is becoming more wobbly. Now, roughly 54 weeks ago today, namely on September 5, 2020, here in the Boulder, Denver area, you had a heat wave. Denver hit 101 degrees Fahrenheit. That was a record to date for Denver for any September in the historical record. But by the evening of September 7, Labor Day, a breakdown of the jet stream brought an incursion of cold Arctic air, first into Wyoming and then to Colorado, dropping the temperature to the low 30s with snow along the Front Range. That actually was the biggest single drop in temperature leading to a snowfall ever before. Here, this depicts that high pressure incursion of the jet stream. And here, you see the very cold air pressing in all directions, including to the west. The coldest air is the purple, but you have cold air that's in the light blue and the dark blue. See that? Pushing to the west, pushing to the southwest and to the west. This was the next day, September 8. Now you can see in California, Oregon, and Washington to some degree that it was very hot on that day as the cold air is pushing west. Next day, even more. You have warm air now in the yellow, that strip from Canada to Mexico, and the cold air in dark blue and light blue pushing west into California, Oregon, and to some degree to Washington. Now, in Oregon, that cold air moving west hit the Cascade Mountain Escarpment, and it went over it, and then bumped into the far hotter strip of air, as I say, that you can see here extending at the time from Canada to Mexico. Now, cold air sinks under hot air, of course. So the air pressed west and it sank. But as it sank, it gained energy after going over the escarpment and going down into the valley and sinking. It gained energy due to the increasing atmospheric pressure. Energy that heated up and expanded that air. And so it became a very rare, for Oregon at least, easterly wind, one that blew hard and increasingly hot. It veritably roared. That westbound hot air, that caused small fires in the forests to explode in ferocity. They became immense conflagrations, and towns not only along the Mackenzie River, but up and down the I-5 corridor were set ablaze, just consumed. In addition, the acrid smoke that ensued from the wildfire hung in the region for nearly 2 weeks, degrading our usually pristine air to worst in the world for the time. I toured the Mackenzie Valley after the embers died back. These are my photos. Here is the Vida Community Center, or its remains. Here, you can see the chimney remains of this once rather glorious riverside home. Here you can see all the plastic and rubber from this old pickup were consumed by the fires, as was the home behind it and the garage around it. Here you see the hulk of a refrigerator still standing. And here you see a school bus that will simply need to be scrapped. So climate change had therefore hit home in a major way for me. And though I'd been working on the problem assiduously for the last 15 years, for the last 12 representing the climate scientist James Hansen in actions all around the country and several around the world, I determined that really I too needed to step it up on climate. And so with a few colleagues, including some on Zoom tonight, I see Don Viviani is here, the president of our board. We launched Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. And actually, we have 3 major initiatives. All of them aim to secure the basic principle that the polluter must pay to clean up its mess. Here, however, I'm only at liberty to discuss the first of these 3. The second major initiative will be able to be publicly talked about in probably 6 weeks or 2 months from now. But this first has to do with the action that the president can take without new congressional authority, that is under existing statutory authority. No additional action by Congress is required. All right, now here I show a bunny because I need to talk politics a bit. And political discussion often causes your blood pressure to rise. But bunnies, they cause it to normalize, hence the bunny. Now, of course, the main economic reason why we continue to use fossil fuels that pollute the atmosphere with dangerous greenhouse gas emissions is because we have not yet priced that pollution. That is, the fossil fuel giants and utilities, they have been free to treat the atmosphere as a free and open sewer for their gaseous emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions. Some of those other emissions actually have been controlled, but not yet greenhouse gas emissions, the main ones that are causing our planet to burn, our seas to rise, increasing our national insecurity. And the fossil fuel giants, the so-called carbon majors, they've worked assiduously to keep it free and foul by ensuring that they control enough senators and representatives while sowing doubt in the public's mind through decades of propaganda about the reality of dangerous climate change. Thus, no serious carbon fee or other major regulation has made it through Congress, and thus, greenhouse gas emissions from the United States remain high, casting doubt, among other things, about our nation's commitment to international accords on climate, commencing with the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to the present. But our fundamental inaction rests on a presumption That is, that the President and the EPA in particular do not already retain sufficient authority to restrict greenhouse gas emissions. But that presumption, as it turns out, was just wrong. And the legal scholar E. Donald Elliott sought to set the record straight in 2019 about that, nearly 30 years following his stint as general counsel to EPA. To quote his operative sentence in this article, EPA does have existing authority to impose a reasonable user fee on releases of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, as well as other pollutants, anytime that it has the political will to do so. How is that possible? Well, in 1952, Congress passed the Independent Offices Appropriations Act, and it allows an executive agency, here the relevant one would be EPA, to impose a reasonable user fee for an industry use of natural resources, and that user fee can be based on policies enunciated by the President in consideration of, among other factors, the public policy to be served. So the connection here is clear. Where you have a resource, the atmosphere, access to which is controlled, at least nominally, by the federal government, it can establish a user fee for polluters to hold permits to continue to contaminate the atmosphere, including an increasing price so as to phase out those emissions. Now, my own contribution here was merely to read Elliott's article and then to recognize its importance. And then I determined that I needed to do something about it. This was something, it seemed to me, that just could not sit on a shelf. And so I discussed this with Dr. Hansen, the famed climate scientist, and he agreed. We needed to do something about this. So 5 days after the inauguration, we wrote to the President explaining that there is this powerful tool that is already at his disposal to accelerate the necessary decarbonization of our power, industrial, agricultural, and transportation systems. That is to say, he can direct the EPA to commence rulemaking leading to the imposition of a revenue-neutral carbon fee, which would rise over time to enable the efficient phase-out of most greenhouse gas emissions. Well, we didn't go public with this at first. As you may recall, soon after his inauguration, the President showed a significant appetite to issue executive orders to reverse a number of the Trump depredations, including in the environmental field, including with respect to climate change. And so we hoped that armed with this, the President would, and his people, and his very talented group of climate advisors, would decide to make use of this authority. And this authority, by the way, has been used by other executive agencies, but never by the EPA. But the EPA is an existing executive agency, and so it too is empowered by the Independent Offices Appropriations Act. But we didn't hear back, despite our efforts to reach them. And so by the end of May, we decided that we should hold this no longer. And so we published a piece in the Boston Globe on June 1st, 2021, calling on the President to immediately impose a rising carbon fee on the fossil fuel industry in order to phase out greenhouse gas emissions without further delay. And we also, the very next day, launched a petition drive. And we have a copy of the petition here if you have not been able to sign it, if you wish to do so, saying to the president that we agree with his determination that we need to address what the president called the existential climate crisis. And we respectfully urge the president to utilize his full executive authority to rapidly phase out fossil fuel emissions. Now, since that time, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its science assessment report on the climate system and prospects for human and natural thriving going into the future, what is required in order to combat the climate crisis. And while the case had been clear from prior assessments reports of the IPCC, this one was more unequivocal than those that preceded it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, among other things, that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that widespread and rapid changes in the ocean, atmosphere, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred, and that more is yet to come. The petition drive to the president, now we have, although we're a small organization, we've been able to secure over 500 signatories, including some leading luminaries, not only Dr. Hansen, and E. Don Elliott, the former general counsel of EPA himself, but also a range of other persons with experience some at high levels within EPA and the scientific community, and they are listed on our website if you wish to see. You would be in good company if you too wish to sign our petition to the president. And it's quite easy for those of you who are not here, but except virtually by Zoom, simply go to our website, cprclimate.org, and there's a button there to take action. Think what a different world this would be had EPA in, say, even the 70s or 80s, or even in the 90s, made use of this authority to impose a rising fee on carbon emissions from the fossil fuel giants. Think what an incentive that would have been for our country to have pressed away from fossil fuels towards alternatives: wind, solar, geothermal, advanced nuclear, the whole panoply. You know, the technologies are there by and large, but we have not made the requisite investments to rapidly move away. This could have been done and can be done still. Now, of course, there are a number of persons in Congress who get it, including even a handful of Republicans who have been organized in part at the behest and pursuant to the arguments of people like the Citizens Climate Lobby. And they have promoted and are promoting now new and effective climate legislation. Here I just show a few of these current measures that are in Congress. There's the Save Our Future Act by Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, a climate champion. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act from Florida's Representative Ted Douche. and 40 co-sponsors in the House. This is one that has been championed directly by Citizens Climate Lobby, and even a solid proposal by Dick Durbin in the Senate, America's Clean Future Fund Act. What these share in common is that they would impose a rising fee, some starting low and moving more rapidly high, some starting higher and moving more slowly, but still upward. And in addition, they share that they would not refund, but dividend the revenues back on a roughly per capita basis to US residents. They also share that they would impose a border tax on imports from nations that do not have a similar policy. Well, I've been asked a few times whether it wouldn't be better actually to have such brand new congressional legislation than simply rely on this older statute, the Independent Offices Appropriations Act of 1952. And of course, my answer is a resounding yes. So long as the legislation that actually passes and is signed into law is not so watered down to concessions to the fossil fuel industry that it would be less effective than an administrative rule promulgated by EPA to implement the Independent Offices Appropriations Act. The problem, however, has been the stranglehold control of Congress by the fossil fuel industry. This year, however, President Biden and congressional leaders have crafted a strategy to actually include many of their preferred climate policies in the so-called budget reconciliation bill. Now, the advantage of that is simply this. If you have a normal piece of legislation, in the House it can pass by a simple majority, but in the Senate it's subject to a filibuster that can be broken only with a majority of 60. So even though one party may control more than 50% of the Senate, if there's a significant minority determined, more than 40, determined to block progress, it can through a filibuster. That can only be broken by the agreement of 60. But in a budget reconciliation bill, that requires only 51 to pass, a simple majority of the Senate. And there are certain limitations. The legislation has to be crafted in such a way that it's directly tied to the budget of the subsequent year or the next decade. And so it doesn't affect, a budget reconciliation provision does not affect the law permanently. But still, if it can affect through incentives and spending changes in actual behavior over a decade-long period, well, that could be something with respect to the climate. So it's a procedure that allows certain legislation or certain ideas to avoid the filibuster. And these are some of the important provisions that are now under consideration, it's still under debate, for the budget reconciliation bill. Many of these would prove, in my view, exceptionally useful. Though the last of them, an across-the-board carbon fee, with revenues returned to Americans as dividends, at least in part. In my view, that could be so effective that some of the various other incentive payment provisions might not be needed. But of course, because a carbon fee is often depicted as a tax, and a significant proportion of legislators feign allergies to taxes, there's an emphasis on some of these other types of programs. So the first is the Clean Energy Payment Program. And that would have the effect, it's sort of like a fee bait. That would have the effect of paying utilities that increase their share of non-fossil fuel energy generation and imposing penalties on utilities that lag behind. It's similar to the renewable portfolio standards of states, or sometimes they're called clean energy standards in states. I think it's called clean energy standard in Colorado, renewable portfolio standard in California and in Oregon. And they have shown some effectiveness, although because of loopholes, they haven't been as effective as they could. So there's a strong such program in the package that is advanced by the president and the Democratic leadership. There are also clean energy tax incentives, specifically to continue the expansion of wind and solar. There are increased and permanent, at least for 10 years, tax incentives for electric vehicle purchases. A very important one, I think, is rebates to enable people to purchase or retrofit their homes or apartment buildings, for example, with electric heat pumps. There are some significant fees that are under consideration for methane emissions. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas over a 80-year period, I believe. Over a 10-year period, it's 84 times more powerful in terms of its climate forcing effect than even CO2. This would compel or incentivize the capture of fugitive emissions from the production and processing of natural gas. And there's some other provisions to help, to specifically target and help overburden and frontline communities so that they can participate in the clean energy revolution that is supposed to be induced by this package. It is presently unclear whether this will succeed. There is a uniform Republican bloc in the Senate that opposes. And so the Democratic majority needs to hold. But there are several Democratic senators, including Joe Manchin of West Virginia, that have said that they oppose at least certain major provisions of the budget reconciliation bill. And it said furthermore that they will not even consider this until the infrastructure bill is passed. 10 days ago, the New York Times covered this, noting that Joe Manchin, who is heavily linked to the fossil fuel industry, now has the role of crafting the United States climate plan. This is frightening, to say the least. It's said that his concern is animated mostly by the residual coal mining industry of West Virginia. But as Paul Krugman pointed out in the New York Times yesterday, that workforce of coal miners in West Virginia has actually decreased to only 13,000 workers. It's dwarfed, for example, by the healthcare industry in West Virginia. What a shame it would be if this package were thwarted because of the senator's short-term interest to assist 13,000 coal miners. Rather, they should be allowed to be retrained and to work in other industries if it becomes necessary, as it appears overwhelmingly certain that in order to restore and protect a viable climate system, we certainly need to rapidly phase out coal among all other fossil fuels. So, but it's been repeatedly stated by Krugman, by the great climate policy analyst David Roberts, that because of the upcoming midterm elections, this may be the last and best chance to do something real and significant and timely about climate in the United States. And so I want to ask the basic question, is that true? Is this the last best real hope to do something before it is too late? And I will close with my answer, because I think that our answer really must be no. It is important what happens over the next few months with respect to the budget reconciliation bill and the climate package as a whole. But if it fails, as we have emphasized, and as we are trying to convey to the White House, even in the absence of new congressional action, the president can direct EPA under existing statutory authority to impose a rising fee on carbon pollution without any further delay. And so then, in our view, there is no excuse for continued action, and act we must. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments, and for persons who are online, all you need to do, if you wish, is to unmute yourself and you can ask a question. But why don't we just take any questions from the in-person audience, take a couple here, and then we'll go to the internet. Yes, back here.
That was a very interesting talk. So I actually never knew about this other way of like implementing a carbon price, but you make it sound like, I mean, it almost sounds like a bit of a loophole, I guess, but I guess like, do people just not know about this? Or like, why did people like not like try to pressure Obama to do this, for example? Or like, I mean, if it's been around since like the 50s, like what's, or like, I guess like, why does CCL like not like ever talk about, why do groups like CCL never talk about something like this?
Well, the truth is people just didn't know about it. And it's not just CCL. I can't say exactly who I've been speaking with, but I can tell you that since we started this petition and since we published that op-ed piece in the Boston Globe, we have had some traction and have had some discussion with people in the White House. And they were unaware of this too. And it's understandable. In fact, if you read the article by Don Elliott, which we have on our website, we published on our website our letter to the president, and our letter to the president has Don Elliott's article attached to it. And so it's all on our website at cprclimate.org. He noted that when he was general counsel of EPA, he was asked by then Administrator William Riley, what can we do about climate change? And so Don, basically, I'm paraphrasing and simplifying, he said, well, you could do this, and you could do that, and you could do this other thing, and we should do those things or consider them because, of course, we can't impose a carbon tax. And but 30 years later, he published in 2019 this article, noting, among other things, that at the time he was studiously ignorant of the Independent Offices Appropriations Act, because it had never been utilized for the purpose. But the language sits there still. Authority available to EPA that is yet untapped. So it's not surprising that advocacy groups or even people in the White House who focus was environmental protection did not know about this because even Don didn't realize this until recently. That's all I can, and you know, also, I've been working as a environmental lawyer focused on climate, but also on environmental policy now for 18 years or so. And I've been through all the environmental classes, and I've, you know, studied the statutes myself. And I didn't know about it, like I say, until I read Don's article. So that's what happens. There's a lot of law out there, and you know, lots of people don't read it all. And so, and it had never been used by EPA for any purpose, not merely with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, right here.
So it seems to me that a revenue neutral fee to a layperson sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. How do you engineer a revenue neutral fee?
You engineer it. So the question is, what is a revenue neutral fee?
Yes.
Because a fee brings in revenue. So how is that revenue neutral? Well, it is by, if you bring in the revenue from certain sources and then you put it out to everyone, then from the perspective of your average citizen, it's revenue neutral. So, and in fact, what the studies that have been done, including some sponsored by CCL, some done at major academic institutions, show is that the average consumer would benefit more from the dividend than they would have to pay in terms of a higher carbon price, a higher gasoline price, higher energy prices. Why? Because it is the wealthy who use a disproportionate amount of energy, by and large. There are certainly some low and moderate income people who have to use a lot, especially gas, if they have to commute long distances. But by and large, those at the bottom 2/3 of the income distribution would tend to gain more in the per capita average dividend than they would have to pay in terms of higher energy costs, prices. And so, and the other aspect of this is that it can be revenue neutral to the extent that the government is putting out in terms of these dividends as much as it's taking in revenues. Less in administrative, less the amount, maybe 3%, that would be necessary to administer the program. That's how it would be revenue neutral. And that's how it would also not have distributional effects that actually should be progressive, not overly burdening low and moderate income households. Yes?
If the EPA enacts this fee, but then the political winds shift, how easy it is for it to get taken down? Like, in other words, how durable is this approach?
Great question. By the way, do people on the internet, are you able to have heard the questions that are being asked? Let's see, Don, are you able to hear the questions asked? Yes, good, okay. To answer the question, I first want to make a concession. If we were to get this done, then as sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, at least some sectors of the fossil fuel industry will go to court to stop it. Okay, so that's clear to me. But this cannot be done immediately by the president telling EPA to do this. Rather, that instruction would commence a rulemaking, notice and comment rulemaking through the Administrative Procedures Act. And so this is important because it means that anyone who wishes has an opportunity to be heard. Without that, the expected challenge could raise constitutional issues. We are affected and we had no opportunity to be heard. And of course, industry companies in the United States believe with justice because of Supreme Court precedent that certain constitutional rights that I believe our founders meant to apply to individuals apply also to corporations. Anyhow, I'm digressing a little bit, but you get the point. They would have the opportunity to be heard in the rulemaking process, as would we. So suppose that they go through this rulemaking process and the Biden EPA does the right thing and they impose a rising carbon fee pursuant to the Independent Offices Appropriations Act. Then there's a legal challenge. Biden administration has to defend it. And we would come in on the side of the Biden administration, supporting its rational rulemaking. And so, it's no slam dunk, particularly under this Supreme Court. It could be reversed, or it could be upheld. I don't know which way it would go. I'm concerned about it. And that's one of the main reasons why I said before that I actually would prefer a new statute specifically on the point, or budget reconciliation provisions specifically on the point that would affect the same thing, because then it would be clear and less subject to legal challenge. But that may not happen. And we're in a crisis. And in a crisis, you use the tools that are at your disposal. And so if the president, if the president, is determined to act, and he's not granted the additional authority under Congress, then he should use the authority that he has and fight for another day, including through the courts if necessary. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the ether. Don Viviani from Honolulu.
I was just swatting a fly. I wasn't raising my hand, but
Oh, okay, thanks,
No,
all right.
no.
Next, yeah.
I would like to make a comment. First of all, if such an act was what if Biden in fact did impose a fee, and it was challenged as it would be challenged, once the public finds out that maybe 70 or 80% of them are going to get money back, I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Congress and others to make sure that this thing stays in place. Once you give folks a benefit, they hate to lose it. The other thing I wanted to say was the economists at EPA, and I was a science advisor to the chief economist at EPA. The economists at EPA are well aware of how we would structure something like this. So it's not like it would take a year or even 6 months to develop such a rule. They could probably have a proposed rule in place within 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, those are great points. I also want to add to that, I believe that this rule would be very popular. After all, there's a lot, not only because of, the activity of CCL, but in part because of their great advocacy and the advocacy of others. But, the science is in. The West is burning up. Sea levels are rising. The ocean is becoming acidified. The IPCC is issuing unequivocal determinations. Still, by the way, I should say that certain scientists, including Dr. Hansen, believe that they are yet still underappreciating the possibility for nonlinear sea level rise of multi-meters within just a few decades. But even the consensus conservative science of the IPCC is exceptionally compelling. We must act. So in the face of that, if they can't get their package through Congress now, and then the Biden administration, working through EPA, commences the rulemaking, there is going to be thousands, maybe tens of thousands of persons formally supporting that by writing in to the record. Who here would write in? We certainly would. And if that then is rejected by the courts, I believe that it would have a boomerang effect because the courts would once again, in my view, with respect to environmental protection, be siding with narrow interests and would not be well received by the public. So it's possible that even if it were overturned in a court, first of all, it might take years. During that period of years, people would be getting their dividends. It would be shown to have an effect in terms of reducing emissions. It should be shown also to have an effect of at least not exacerbating inequality and potentially assisting with that problem. It would become a popular program, similar to the British Columbia program and similar to the Alaska Native Interest Lands program, where there's a annual dividend given to Alaskan citizens. Highly popular program, even in that very conservative state. So I think that it certainly would be worth the litigation risk to pursue. See, other questions from, yes, right here.
You mentioned that you've had conversations with people in the White House, but have you actually had like communications with the Biden administration? And when you arrive in DC, do you expect to actually like be received or have your message?
Will I be received? Do you mean will I be well received? Yes, we have had, and I don't want to really talk about it, but when I say we've had discussions with people in the White House, that means discussions with the Biden administration. But we do not have the president saying, yes, I am going to do this. But we have successfully, I think, put this in the field of vision. However, we're trying to greatly amplify the effectiveness of our petition by getting a lot more signatures on it. And why? Because, because we're trying to show that there's, at least among people who hear about this, that there's significant support for this, that the president should utilize every option at his disposal that seems viable. And so that's the reason why, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm going around the country trying to give these types of talks and through Zoom, because we want to be able to show a significant number of persons understand and appreciate and support this type of an effort. Yes, sir.
Have you seen any numbers or like preliminary things, like say the tax is $50 on a ton of carbon? What kind of cost that would, be on a normal, family or something like that, and what kind of dividend they would receive?
Yes. Absolutely. There are about 6 different studies on this. And I can't rattle them. I've read a few of them, but I can't rattle them off in detail. But they all indicate that, and it depends on where you start the fee and how fast you increase it. I will say that a study by the International Monetary Fund is one that we cited to in our op-ed in the Boston Globe. And it indicates a substantial effect on emissions once the fee gets to $75 a metric ton. I personally believe that, we certainly should not stop at $75 a metric ton. We should keep on going until this has a significant bite and is helping phase out all residual fossil fuel emissions. But it's interesting to note that even merely at $75 a metric ton, it's slated to have a significant impact. So, and those studies also show how much revenues would be collected, what would be the average burden on the average household, or up and down the income distribution, how much would be returned on a per capita basis to households, and then doing that comparison to indicate that about 2/3 of the income of the households would receive more in dividends than they would have to pay due to increased energy prices and gas prices. So yeah, those studies are there. They are, I think you're a member of Citizens Climate Lobby. If you go to the Citizens Climate Lobby website, those studies are listed there and are available for you to download. Yes. Okay, Don.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that if you look at what the actual costs in terms of disamenities to people, in terms of storms, in terms of property values, in terms of morbidity and mortality, each ton of carbon costs anywhere from $500 to $700 or $800 per person, per ton rather. So clearly $75 doesn't make much of a difference there. And the average person has a carbon footprint of about 15 or maybe 20 tons of carbon. So if you multiply that by 75, that would probably be close to what he'd be paying. And since a lot of folks use a lot more, they'd be putting a lot more into the fund. So the average person, therefore, would actually get money back at the end of the year.
Right. That's right.
And it'd be some incentive to switch, right? There's a lot of incentive.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, would that be enough incentive to switch? And, certain things are very expensive. But, if you combine your dividend with, for example, some of these tax incentives that they're talking about in the budget reconciliation bill, and you think about the savings in terms of gasoline, for example, over a 5-year period, then some of the more moderately priced electric vehicles become attractive even to persons at the lower end of the spectrum, especially if they need to use automobiles a lot. But certain other and certain retrofits of housing, putting in more insulation, that is reasonably affordable. Putting on an entire solar array, that may be less affordable, but there are certain kinds of programs that, for example, feed-in tariffs that are being pursued by some states could come in and help fill the gap and allow your average homeowner to be able to put on solar arrays as well. So yeah, it all makes some sense. I personally believe that a significant fee and dividend program would make great sense, but in the absence of it, this panoply of climate policies in the reconciliation bill make some sense as well. So, yes, ma'am.
So a big keystone for the Citizens Climate Levy favorite bill, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, has a component which is the border carbon adjustment fee. And can you speak to, my understanding is that the EPA could not regulate that component, but that's a key component because otherwise US manufacturing would take a hit compared to foreign countries who do not have that kind of carbon fee built into their system.
Yeah.
So could using the statute that you were kind of promoting tonight, could the EPA impose that kind of border carbon adjustment?
No.
Well, that's a big problem
No.
then.
But a carbon border adjustment is exceptionally popular in Congress. So I don't think that will be a problem. I think that they'll probably go through in the Budget Reconciliation Act, even if some of the other provisions don't go through. Or I think it's quite easy to get that piece through Congress. Why? Because it, because it ensures against the competitive loss of American businesses.
So you think Congress could institute a border carbon adjustment without imposing a fee
Yes.
on its own
Yes,
citizens
yes,
already?
I think they could. I think there's a significant cart before the horse problem there. But this has already been talked about a lot this year in Congress. And what would it be based on? Well, it would be based on the other regulatory programs that, including state regulatory programs, that they say lead to the United States having already more controls over greenhouse gas emissions than other nations. As I say, I think there is a significant cart before the horse problem. But in the event either of the use of the Independent Offices Appropriations Act or a fee that's imposed through the Budget Reconciliation Act, or in the event of these the CEPP program with respect to utilities, any of that I think would effectively have the result of ensuring that there were some significant limitations on such emissions in the United States to justify imposition under other law of border adjustments. So yeah, I think I believe that that's going to happen, even if the fee and dividend is not enacted, or even if the Independent Offices Appropriations Act rule does not come out quickly. I think that's going to happen. Okay, any others? All right, well, thank you very much for your participation and your interest. And I, in closing, just welcome all of you to get engaged with our organization, to utilize the resources that we're trying to develop. Let's get this thing done. Thank you very much.